Modern historians currently claim that there are three separate Roman empires that have existed throughout time. Modern historians are lying to you. Very few people, including historians, realize that ancient Rome was quite literally created by only a small handful of authors. One of those authors was known as Petrarch. So it gets a little weird when we find Petrarch arriving in Rome in the middle of the 1300s AD, and he writes the following, quote, "Where are the thermae of Diocletian and Caracalla? Where is the Timberium of Marius, the Septizonium and the thermae of Severus? Where is the Forum of Augustus and the Temple of Mars the Avenger? Where are the holy places of Jupiter the Thunderbearer on the Capitol and Apollo on the Palatine? Where is the Portico of Apollo and the Basilica of Caius and Lucius? Where is the Portico of Libya and the Theatre of Marcellus? Where are the Temple of Hercules and the Muses built by Marius Philip, and the Temple of Diana built by Lucius Cornelius? Where is the Temple of Free Arts of Avanius Pollio? Where is the Theatre of Balbus, the Amphitheatre of Statutalis Taurus? Where are the numerous constructions erected by Agrippa, of which only the Pantheon remains? Where are the splendorous palaces of the emperors? One finds everything in the books, but when one tries to find them in the city, one discovers that they either disappeared or that only the vaguest of their traces remain." Unquote. So we have a problem. And if you don't know what that problem is, essentially, what has happened is that one of the fathers of the creation of ancient Roman history goes down to Rome, and when he starts looking for all of these historical buildings that were supposed to exist during the period of ancient Rome, he finds almost nothing. He literally complains that he is unable to find almost anything from any of the ancient Roman stories that he is aware of with respect to their understanding of history during the Middle Ages. Now, you would think this would have caused, I don't know, maybe a few eyebrows to be raised, even during this period of time. And to be fair, it did. But, I mean, you would think that especially nowadays, historians would look back on somebody like Petrarch and see a quote like this directly from him and maybe start wondering what the hell is going on. What we are going to do today is we are going to continue to break down the lie that there are three separate Roman empires and that modern chronology is completely incorrect. So right now we have a situation to where when people are dating anything throughout history, one of the time periods that they will use to calibrate their dates will be Roman chronology. Roman chronology is one of those chronologies that is now taken as an absolute sacred situation that you are not allowed to touch whatsoever. Because of this, what has happened is that any new discovery that is made archaeologically or historically in whatever context that, it's found in, what happens is that when that historian or that archaeologist goes to try and date their new finding, one of the major chronological systems that they are going to use to date that finding is going to be Roman chronology. And the reason why they are going to have no problem using Roman chronology, even if their subject is not even necessarily related to Rome, is because at the very least, Roman chronology supposedly goes back over 2,000 years at the very least. So what that gives your average modern historian is that gives them, a good 2,000 years of supposed well-known time periods that you can go and you can compare your new discovery against and then potentially date whatever discovery it is you have. And people do that every single day now. So when somebody makes a new discovery, they do not approach their discovery and their dating methodology objectively. What they do is they build on top of a foundation that is already ready-made for them to date whatever the hell it is they're trying to date. Now, initially, this sounds fine, because technically this is what we should be doing. But what happens if that chronology, if that time frame is completely fictitious? What happens if Roman chronology is just wrong? And I don't mean like a few years off or maybe a few decades off or something like that. Even modern historians will have no problem kind of, going along with something like that. Even they will admit that they do not have the exact date. At least the more honest ones will admit that. So, for example, if you're a historian and you've been doing a lot of work and you realize that, oh, hey, maybe, I don't know, one of the Lucius's current dates in mainstream chronology might be wrong by a year or two, other historians will probably go along with that, as long as you have some evidence. You probably won't get too much pushback, but even they will get pushback because you have to realize the other side of that coin is that there are a lot of mainstream historians which absolutely believe all of the dates that we have right now for all, the whole Roman chronology, for example, is 100% accurate. I mean, there are literally historians out there in high-level positions of power who have no problem telling you that they know the precise date for every single little event that took place 800 years ago. Like, they just know it. They know it precisely, and if you disagree with them, you are the crazy conspiracy theorist, right? You are not allowed to challenge their authority. Anyway, so of course, that entire situation exists in mainstream history as well. But, on the flip side, I do want to give mainstream historians some credit because there are good ones out there who will at least, be willing to tweak the date a little bit here or there. However, what you are not allowed to do with any of those mainstream historians is you are not allowed to tweak the date by centuries, and you are certainly not allowed to delete the historical supposed event. The events are sacred, right? The chronology is basically sacred. You are not allowed to touch Roman chronology any longer. What has been established is now 100% fact for the mainstream. However, is that true? Is that the point that we really have reached in history? Do we really have that level of knowledge regarding a time period that is up to 2,000 years into the past? And of course, the obvious answer and the common sense answer is no. Absolutely. We do not have anywhere near that kind of data that would support any kind of a chronology that the mainstream currently holds as the holy scripture of history. It just doesn't exist. And this is a scientific fact. And that's one of the things that I would like to establish today in this show is the scientific fact that modern chronology is completely wrong. Why does this matter, though? The reality is this channel is trying to prove scientifically that multiple catastrophes have hit this planet only within the past, 5, 6, 10,000 years and has completely changed everything regarding human history. So why does Roman history matter to something like that? Well, it's simple. The catastrophes that we talk about now and where the science has pointed us is these catastrophes, like I said, they're not millions and billions of years old. The catastrophes that we are trying to get a handle on are only a few thousand years old. They are not that long ago. Now, of course, this does not jive at all with anything in modern mainstream history, which is ironic because even modern mainstream historians will kind of, on the side acknowledge that some pretty horrific stuff has gone down down relatively recently, but they never really add that to the textbooks. They never really say those parts out loud. You kind of really have to poke and prod them to kind of get them to say anything about it. I mean, it's funny. The entire Mediterranean area is a literal graveyard of civilizations, and we do not have any kind of a grasp on what happened to a lot of them. And it's even crazier when you think about some of those cities and civilizations are literally hundreds, if not thousands of feet underwater, right? That stuff is absolutely insane, and that's the stuff that your general historian will kind of ignore, right? Oh, it's just natural. I mean, yes, the ocean must have risen, I guess 400 feet in the past few thousand years, but that's totally normal, everybody. Don't worry about it. We don't need to talk about it or discuss it, or I mean, that's the way they look at it, right? Okay, anyway. What we need to do, though, if we are going to prove correctly that these catastrophes have taken place, we need to have a solid chronology. We have got to have something that we can actually date these catastrophes with that are not based on frivolous garbage history. Unfortunately, in modern history, that's what modern history is based on. I mean, that is quite literally what modern history is based on. When you go and you read a modern history book, you find chronology that is based on Egyptian chronology, Roman chronology, and Greek chronology. Those are the three foundational chronologies in which essentially all modern history is based off of. So, if you're a modern historian and all of a sudden if you are a modern historian and you are suddenly presented with a ton of evidence that shows you that one or all three of those chronologies are incorrect, what does that mean essentially for your entire life? I mean, if your entire life's work is based off of a corrupt foundation, I mean, what do you do with that, right? I mean, you have an authoritative power structure right now that pushes a very specific historical foundation, and you are not allowed to challenge it. And so most people don't. And of course, if you do challenge it, you're exiled. And then you go and you make YouTube channels like this, and then you have like 10 subscribers. That's your fate. I don't know what to tell people. So, I mean, you can either do this and be stuck making garbage YouTube videos, or you can go get paid, scholarships and salaries up in the mainstream universities and live a happy life. That's your choice. Do you want to be a homeless, historical, catastrophist YouTuber, or do you want to be a rich, mainstream academic who pushes lies, right? Hey, the choice is yours. You do whatever you want, but hey, that's what you can do. Okay. So if any of the chronologies are wrong, suddenly the entire picture of history that you have been taught falls apart. Now, technically, from a scientific perspective, that's okay. It's not a problem, because once you approach things scientifically, you should expect things to change as you gain more evidence. The problem is that mainstream historians do not approach history with a scientific mindset. They approach history from a mindset that everybody that has come before them has figured it all out, and all they have to do is build upon what has been before them. That's it, and that's what most historians do nowadays, and alternative historians do this as well. One of the other problems that we have when it comes to catastrophism is that we find people, even in the catastrophist realm, they still use modern chronology to date catastrophes, right? You can't do that because there's no reason to believe any of that anyway. So that's what we're going to do today. We are going to continue to tear down modern chronology so that we can get a better understanding of when these catastrophes actually took place. So we have to tear down Roman chronology. The reason why we have to tear down Roman chronology is, as I said earlier, too much of modern history is based on what is supposedly established Roman chronology. Things get even more hairy, of course, because once we start to tear down Roman chronology, Egyptian chronology and Greek chronology will also unravel. Why? Well, because this is another problem with modern history, but modern historians literally use circular logic to build up their historical narrative. By that, what I mean is that Egyptologists will use Greek and Roman chronology to calibrate Egyptian chronology. A Greek chronologist will use Egyptian and Roman chronology to calibrate Greek chronology. Do you see where I'm going with this? Yeah, that is literally what mainstream historians do. This is how they have built up their picture. All three chronologies in the mainstream are scientifically provably incorrect. What that means is that we essentially have no real chronology whatsoever to base any kind of human history off of right now, at least with respect to how the mainstream Western way looks at things. So it gets a little weird then to think about the fact that if all three of those chronologies are wrong, how the hell are all of these historians making these claims and then running around telling us that we're the crazy people if we don't believe them, if their stupid chronologies are wrong? It just make... Petrarch is one of the scholars that went around trying to figure out what was going on with ancient Rome. Now, this guy lived during the Renaissance. And don't forget, the Renaissance is a period in time when history as we know it suddenly started to get pieced together. Before this period of time, before the Middle Ages, before the Renaissance, there was no real chronology, so to speak of, right? There was absolutely no dating methodology that was universal. And that's also something that's important to remember, and it's something that should be said more often. Don't forget, our current dating system has only been around for a few hundred years. It has not been around for thousands of years, right? Nobody in, the BC era was writing, 29 BC. I went over there and took a dump on my neighbor's yard or whatever. Nobody was writing dates like that. Everybody, every civilization had their own dating methodology. So when we look at dates that are in the ancient past, it really begs the question, how the hell are modern historians and chronologists calibrating their dating methods relative to ancient dating methods? And then, of course, it gets even crazier because as we go further back in time, we find a situation to where even calendars were different. And by that, I mean, the year was not 365 days a year. There was a period of time where it was 360 days. And then there's another period of time where it was just shy of under 300 days, etc., etc. Anyway, so obviously there's some calibration problems. And of course, the mainstream doesn't talk about any of this. All of that stuff, the mainstream just attributes to our ancestors being stupid monkeys who could not figure out how to calculate a single year, right? Nobody could do that for some weird reason up until, the past 1,000 years or whatever. Anyway. During the Renaissance, we find a situation to where scholars suddenly decide that they really do want to create a real chronology of all of history. And so that's what starts happening. And of course, Petrarch is just one of many authors who will start to build up a history of the world. And his focus will ultimately be trying to piece together what ancient Rome was like. So let's go and see what Petrarch did, because Petrarch's important. Because what Petrarch ultimately would do is that he would help shape a ton of perception on how modern day historians now view ancient Rome. If you go right now and you grab a mainstream historical book, I guarantee you will find Petrarch cited multiple times in that book. It's also important to note that Petrarch is only one of a few authors that really does this. So basically, when you look at the way modern day historians have compiled information trying to build up a real picture of a supposed ancient Roman Empire, or 3 Roman empires supposedly, you find a ridiculous situation to where you only have like 3, 4, or 5 authors that are really ever trusted and cited by the mainstream. Right, and Petrarch is one of those authors. Another one would be somebody like Tacitus, for example. There's not many. We do not have like this huge ancient Roman library that we found somewhere and scholars just dug through it and then just, were able to put together all of these perfect chronological dates. We have none of that at all. It's extremely important to remember that none of that existed. This is why Petrarch was trying to figure stuff out. Even during Petrarch's time, ancient Rome literally did not exist. How do you like that? In the 1300s AD, people did not even have any idea of the real existence of a Roman Empire. They were just told that one had to have existed. And this is where Petrarch will come into the picture. Because as Petrarch was growing up during the 1300s, what was happening is that, all these other authors, they were starting to piece together a world history. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that during this period of time, there was a huge problem of forgeries. I mean, they were everywhere. It was literally an industry. So Petrarch was growing up in a time when historical forgeries were running rampant. Even worse, some of these historical forgeries had already been accepted into the chronology of that time frame. So when Petrarch is growing up, he is learning from a forged history. So Petrarch will eventually end up going out to look for and to try and prove that this history that he grew up on was real. And the reason why he wants to do this is because nobody can find anything. Right, he's read all of these books which talk about the magnificence of the Roman Empire, about all this crazy stuff going on. Remember that quote I said at the beginning of this show. He's looking for all of these amazing claims that the books that he read are saying existed. So he is already at a disadvantage. So Petrarch was just trying to do something good. I don't think Petrarch was ever trying to go out of his way to create a worse mess than what already existed. Because in all honesty, he had no reason necessarily to believe that everything that he currently believed was, a complete forgery, was false, was a lie, etc. He was just, he was trusting the people that came before him, right? And it's the same problem that we have nowadays. He got excited about his subject and he wanted to believe what he had read in the books were real. And so eventually he would set out to go to Rome and he would try to see if he could prove that any of that stuff existed. Now, what's ironic about that, what this means, is that already during his time, there was already evidence that none of it did exist, right? And don't forget, during the Renaissance period, when all of these historical forgeries are starting to appear, there are tons of other historians which are calling out the forgeries, by the way. There are a lot of forgeries which did get called out and were indeed eliminated from the historical chronology. So it's not all doom and gloom. There were people doing good stuff. But, at the end of the day, once people like the Jesuits got involved in their power structure, the lies got pushed to the front. And that's a whole other topic, and I'm not going to get into all of this. I just want to focus on Petrarch. So I don't want to paint Petrarch as some evil dude who was sitting there trying to, create huge lies and trying to manipulate history. I don't think that's what he was trying to do. Now, I can't say that 100% because I don't know Petrarch personally. I never met the dude. I don't know. Maybe he would and was trying to do that ultimately in the end. I don't know. It's possible. Anyway, the reason why we need to go talk about Petrarch, and I want to look at what happened with this guy and what he created and why he ultimately is wrong, is because so much of modern history is based on what this guy ends up writing. So let's get down to Petrarch. This guy would ultimately be called the father of humanism, and he would ultimately be credited with a few kinds of things that he did back during his time. So one of the main things that we're going to talk about and that he was credited with was rediscovering Roman texts. So Petrarch starts digging around and he starts asking everybody and his mom to go and find texts that would give him any kind of information regarding anything with ancient Rome. Now, of course, there's a problem with this because finding ancient Roman texts is no longer an issue because there is an entire industry set up to provide anybody who's looking for Roman texts. And of course, Petrarch at the end of the day will discover, quote unquote, tons of these texts. All right. Another thing he does for some weird reason is he goes and he starts advocating for classical Latin. The Latin situation during the Renaissance, it gets weird because Latin is supposed to end up being a dead language. Latin is supposed to be like this root language for all kinds of other languages. The whole problem of Latin and how old it actually is and what role it truly played in history is actually a whole other show in and of itself. But so the fact that Petrarch actually even cared about ancient Latin says a lot about what may have been transpiring during this time period. And that's kind of a different show. I don't want to get crazy with it, but he is known for doing that as well. So ultimately, what Petrarch will end up doing when he starts digging through all of this stuff of Rome is that he will eventually, essentially become kind of a fanboy for ancient Rome. He starts to really get involved in it, like crazy involved in it. You know, like people nowadays get involved in those stupid TV shows and they just can't realize that they're watching slop and it's all programming to make sure that you stay down and that you do not rebel against the system. Yeah, stop watching all of the slop, by the way. It's not good for you. There is not a single program on any of those streaming websites that is good for you. Not a single one. Every single one has psychological programming in it. Every single one is calculated. Every single one is designed to ensure that your psychological chains stay on. Okay, I know, schizo stuff, but it's the truth. Stop. Okay. Anyway, Petrarch gets obsessed with ancient Rome. When he gets obsessed with ancient Rome, he obviously wants to go and find everything he can collect for it, right? So he's just like one of those guys who tries to collect action figures and all that crap for his, favorite thing. And so he starts to do that. Now, one of the reasons why I believe that Petrarch was not trying to do anything malicious is that he actually went out of his way to critique the way history was being done during the medieval period of time. So what was going on during the medieval period of time is that you had a lot of theology mixed in with your history. And so, he saw that and he was not appreciative of that. Let's put it like that. And he actually goes out of his way to try and get everything he can on the ancient Roman Empire from a real historical perspective and not a theological one. So what that shows to me is that psychologically, especially during this time period, right? Because theology is everywhere during this period of time. It shows me that Petrarch probably really did have a passion for the truth about ancient Rome. So the stuff he writes, it's well intended. Let's put it like that. Now, there's an ironic problem with this because Petrarch would eventually be credited with coining the term the Dark Ages. And he used the term the Dark Ages to describe the period between the fall of Rome and his own time. All right, so he caused more damage probably than he realized he was doing. But you have to remember, during his period of time, he did not have the internet. Corresponding with people all over the world was not happening, right? He was not doing hardcore archaeology. Nobody was really doing nobody was doing any kind of archaeology. There was just looting, right? The whole situation basically sucked if you lived back during that period of time and you were trying to find the truth. So when somebody like Petrarch takes a supposed legitimate, approach to trying to piece together history, he's going to run into all kinds of problems, which he will never know are problems. And this is what leads us to our problem. So let's go over some of the things that Petrarch would end up writing and discovering that would end up causing all kinds of problems for history, and that would eventually solidify into the foundation of history as we know it. Once you guys start to see all of this stuff that he did and you start to see the problems, you will begin to see the cracks in modern chronology. Once those cracks start to show up, right, it should shake your faith in the believability in that chronology. And then we can hopefully get to a point to where you can discard modern chronology and we can start looking for the truth. Anyway, later on in his life, supposedly around 1337, he will eventually go and visit the Italian Rome for the first time. So what did he find there? Well, here's what Petrarch writes. Now, as a side note, and I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but even the character of Petrarch, we can actually call him into question as well. And by that I mean we can call Petrarch's existence into question. We don't actually know if Petrarch is a real dude. All we know is that we have Petrarch's writings, and Petrarch's writings make all of these claims about Rome and about himself, etc., etc. But, the reality is, from a scientific perspective, nobody can prove that Petrarch was a legitimate living human being. It's entirely possible that Petrarch is a creation of some other writer who was using the name Petrarch as an alias, for their own writing, which of course then brings in a whole other, crap load of problems. Then, it's like, okay, so why is somebody writing under the name of Petrarch about all of this stuff about Rome while simultaneously kind of trying to build a picture up of Rome? The whole thing gets just crazy. Anyway, that's the situation that we have. That's what we have, which makes the situation even crazier. Because if Petrarch is not a real person, that means Petrarch was not doing all the stuff that maybe he was claiming being done in all of his letters and writings. And then that adds a whole other layer of garbage that we have to tear through. You see where we're going with this, though? Do you see the theme with how mainstream chronology has been built? I mean, the foundation is literally just a house of cards. I mean, it's just garbage. We can't this show was going to be used to simply look at Petrarch and call out all of the problems that Petrarch himself kind of accidentally discovers and doesn't necessarily adhere to, but his works are a perfect highlight into all of the issues with the foundations of modern chronology. But it gets even more insane when we think about the possibility that Petrarch himself literally never existed and somebody else just wrote under the name of Petrarch and created all of this garbage for whatever reason, right? There's all kinds of reasons why people would have forged stuff, which really then would invalidate this entire show, which means that I could shut up now and we really could scientifically just say that Petrarch probably never existed, which means a lot of the conclusions that he came to also, of course, are ridiculous. And, none of it works. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Okay. Anyway, let's keep going. Oh, and by the way, as we go through this, I want to give credit to Anatoly Fomenko for some of this stuff. He did a lot of work on this, and he and his team, probably his team as well, not just him, they made a lot of these discoveries. So it's not me making these discoveries. Don't think that. I'm absolutely using much more intelligent people's research for this stuff. Okay. Anyway, let's get back to Petrarch, and let's just pretend he exists for right now. Okay. Anyway, so in 1337, Petrarch finally decides he is going to go and visit Italian Rome. So when he gets down there, he immediately does indeed find ruins. He finds them, okay? And he writes, quote, "Rome seemed even greater to me than I could have imagined, especially the greatness of her ruins." Unquote. Now, I know that doesn't sound like anything interesting, but the date and the ruins are interesting because in 1337, Petrarch is already seeing ruins of what he supposes is Rome. This is going to be important because the ramifications for ancient Rome never existing means that all of those buildings, they had to have existed at some point, right? I'm not claiming, and nobody's claiming, that all of those ruins that exist over there in the Mediterranean area were not built by some kind of a civilization. Nobody's claiming that. There are ruins there. It's just right now Rome gets the credit for all of those ruins. And all of that credit is ascribed to those ruins by the mainstream. When we actually start to look at real chronology and we try to figure out, where the hell did those ruins come from? Because they're there. We're not denying that. What that means is that somebody had to have built them, but who the hell built them? If the ancient Romans never existed, that means they never built them, then who did? So somebody had to have built them. So when were they actually built? And then when did they fall into ruin? So the date of 1337, if, it's accurate, and so right now we'll just roll with it, whatever. It's close. The dates from around the Middle Ages on up are a little more reliable. But, don't make any mistake, actually. Even dates in the 1300s, we really can't rely on even those. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but the reality is our current dating system that we use right now probably really was not reliable up until maybe the latter 1600s. And I mean like truly reliable in a way that you could look at it and be like, yeah, it's probably right. Like you could start to let yourself go without constantly questioning it. But I would argue that any time before the 1600s AD, you have to be extremely careful. Because don't forget, just because the AD chronology, is implemented, that does not mean the entire planet started using it right then and there. People were still using their own dating methods literally all the way up until the 19th century, right? And we could probably find examples up to the 20th century. I mean, and the reality is we can still find examples up to right now if we really want to be smartasses about it. So we still have to be careful with the dates. Anyways, for our purposes in this show, 1337 shows that the ruins existed at this point. Okay, fine. So whatever created the ruins had already happened. Anyway, Petrarch arrives down there in Italian Rome. And when he gets down there, he finds that he is met with tons of legends regarding the area. And from these legends, this is where the quote-unquote poet, remember, Petrarch is, he's a humanist. He's a great humanist. Sometimes they call him a poet. Anyway, this is where Petrarch will start to cull what stories he believes belongs to ancient Rome and which ones do not. How do you like that? That is the basis for how Petrarch starts to officially put together the history of ancient Rome. So when he gets down to Italian Rome, there's, everybody's talking about all kinds of crazy stuff, and rightfully so, because, this is kind of outside of the scope of this show, but, probably about 3 to 4 centuries earlier to this period of time, there was the last great catastrophe that this planet had ever gone through. So all of the people wandering around during this period of time, they still would have sort of had some freshness of some of the legends that still existed from that catastrophe, and then from the people who had recovered from the catastrophe and who had tried to rebuild the area. So it gets crazy down there. So everybody's got all of these crazy stories. Petrarch starts running into all of these legends, and then he decides at the end of the day which ones are going to be ancient Roman and which ones are not. And there is absolutely no solid or scientific basis for any of this. This is what historians do not want to hear. Because the reality is, Petrarch just picks and chooses what he likes. He just goes through all of the stories and starts to compile the ones that creates the picture of ancient Rome that he was conditioned to believe in. Now, one of the problems that Petrarch ends up running into is that he starts to discover there is a significant amount of historical and scientific evidence that proves that all of these structures were not built over 1,000+ years ago for his time period, but were instead only a few hundred years old. What that was meaning is that these structures may have been medieval in origin. And in fact, as he started wandering around Rome, he started to find that more and more to be true. Now, of course, that's a problem because you can't have ancient Roman structures being built during the early Middle Ages, right? You can't have that. It doesn't work, or at least it does not work with mainstream chronology, and it didn't work with Petrarch's current perception of what he was supposed to find in Italian Rome. So what he started to do is, as he was collecting all of these stories and legends, etc., he was omitting any of those tales that did not line up with his preconceived notion. So basically, he was just getting rid of all kinds of legitimate evidence for no other reason other than it did not work with what he was expecting to find. So we have a problem. When we find mainstream historians citing somebody like Petrarch to develop the picture of what ancient Rome was like, right? They're not telling us about all of the evidence that Petrarch discarded. They too are doing the exact same thing that Petrarch is doing. Modern day historians already have a preconceived notion of what ancient Rome was like. And of course, that comes from people like Petrarch, but it's even worse in our time nowadays. Because in modern time period, we have a situation to where we can visually see all this crazy Roman stuff going on in the movies and in television shows, etc. And then we have a mainstream academic institution claiming that much of what you are seeing there on TV and movies, etc., are pretty close to really how it was going down in Rome at the time. To make matters worse, of course, the time period we live in now, things have gone even further and things have been twisted and, they've been bent out of shape to make things even more insane. And of course, because people are getting more and more stupid, people are not calling out other inaccuracies in TV shows and movies, etc. So what's happened is that the modern day population quite literally believes that all of that stuff that you're watching in the movies is literally, or at least pretty damn close to what was going on in a period called the ancient Roman Empire. Right? It's a completely fictitious situation, but the kind of power that all of those visual cues have on the development of history itself, it's there and it's undeniable and there's no way to get away from it. Anyway, so you have modern day historians taking stuff like Petrarch, and then you have them taking stuff like all the stuff in the media and the news and all that garbage with respect to ancient Rome, and they now have like a super twisted version of what they expect to be ancient Rome. To make it even worse, if you happen to bring up any of these medieval similarities or any of the evidence that those structures existed in an earlier medieval period of time and not, in the early first millennium or the early, first millennium BC or AD or whatever, what'll happen is that a mainstream historian will tell you that, oh, no, wait a second. No, those are just anachronisms. People were just crazy. They were just mixing up time periods. No, we're pretty sure that we know exactly what happened during the ancient Roman period. And any kind of other evidence that proves us wrong, well, yeah, it's just an anachronism. So we can just push it to the side and we don't have to worry about it. That is quite literally the mainstream's position when you present tons of other information to the contrary of what they currently believe with respect to the ancient Roman empires. You are not allowed to disagree with them. If you actually have evidence that does disagree with them, just like when Petrarch goes down to Italian Rome and finds that there's all kinds of evidence that disagrees with his preconceived notions, what happens is you just have to push it aside. Modern historians now just call them anachronisms, and since 90% of the planet has no clue what an anachronism is, they can get away with it. Which also means that I probably should not have named my channel Anachronistic Affliction, because 90% of the planet has no clue what an anachronistic affliction even is, so nobody knows what this channel is even talking about. Okay. So we've established that there is a problem with anything that Petrarch ends up writing. He is writing, or recording, I should say. He is only recording what he thinks is the correct stuff that should have happened with respect to ancient Rome. Now, right here, I can end the show and say this invalidates all of Petrarch, which means that anybody who cites Petrarch is also immediately invalidated, which means that the mainstream chronology has been invalidated. And now, if we come from a scientific perspective, we should be starting with a blank slate when it comes to creating a worldwide chronology. And of course, that's not going to be happening, but okay, whatever. So what are the other problems that Petrarch runs into that really does prove that, the current concept of how we look at ancient Rome is wrong? Well, let's look at the legends that he started to run into. Now, what's interesting about a lot of the legends that he finds, and we can find evidence for all this stuff that I'm about to talk about in many other historical contexts as well, and we'll have to cover that in other shows. But check this out. For example, Right now, if I were to say the word Hercules, if I were to ask you, well, when did Hercules live? You'd be like, well, he's an ancient Greek dude or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Or if I were to say, hey, when was, Troy, the Battle of Troy, right? When did that take place? People would throw it back. I think right now, mainstream even agrees that it's like the 750s-ish BC. Anyway, the BC kind of Greekish era. We throw it back several thousand years, essentially. What's fascinating is that when Petrarch arrives down there in Italian Rome, he starts to run into all kinds of legends. And oddly enough, a lot of these legends are describing not ancient Roman or Greek legends, but the people are making the claims that a lot of legends that are usually ascribed to ancient Rome and ancient Greek are actually medieval in origin. For example, the Venetians claimed that Venice was built from the stones of the destroyed Troy. And they do not claim that Troy is thousands of years old. They literally believe that the battle for Troy only took place a few centuries before their births. And that's what they're telling Petrarch. It gets even more interesting because they also have stories of, say, somebody like where Achilles used to rule. Right? They claim that he used to rule in Abruzza and not the Myrmidons of Pythia. So why are people telling Petrarch all these weird stories? I mean, from Petrarch's perspective, these kinds of stories were supposedly supposed to take place a couple of thousand years even before his time. But he finds the population telling him about their own history in the area happening only a few centuries ago, and in some cases, not even that long ago. Another weird situation that he runs into when he heads over to Milan is that he finds all of the people in that particular area, for some weird reason, worshiping a statue of Hercules. Now, if that doesn't sound weird to you, let me give you some context. In medieval Italy, there was no reason to worship a statue of Hercules. If modern chronology is correct, Hercules is a god that's like 2,000 years old, right? Nobody's really going to be worshiping that, especially considering we now have Christianity kind of spreading and paganism and all kinds of other stuff going on. Why do we find a situation to where people are revering a statue of Hercules? It gets even crazier. How the hell did a statue of Hercules magically survive 2,000 plus years down to this point? Now, that actually touches on a whole other problem that people don't really think about, and that's really the second law of thermodynamics. When we get down to it, people generally believe that stone statues or anything made in stone essentially lasts forever, right? They think that, oh, you carved it in stone, it's going to be there for the next 10 million years and all that garbage. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, stone is a very good construction material, and it's hardy and it lasts long, depending on the stone you carve it from, etc. But at the end of the day, the stone still needs to survive all the trials and tribulations of history. So what historians are asking us to believe when we see statues like this statue of Hercules that's being worshipped is they want us to believe that this statue survived for 2,000 plus years untouched in great condition between all of the kinds of religious turmoil that existed, all of the dark ages, all of the destruction that happens, etc., etc. This statue miraculously survives. And it's not just that statue that miraculously survives. There's all kinds of miraculous statues that for some magical reason go untouched for 2,000 years until finally they show up, during the medieval period to where they kind of start to appear out of nowhere. That should be a huge red flag for everybody, by the way, because what I just said is that all of these stone statues that are right now, for example, being attributed to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they are not an ancient construction. They were all created during the Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages, or if we want to get even more interesting with things, we could say that the statues, a lot of the statues, may have been created right before the early Middle Ages kicks off. And they could have been created before that last cataclysm. It's kind of outside of the scope of this talk, but that's a possibility, and that's something we have to actually take serious and keep in mind. Remember, the reason why these people are worshiping that statue is because that statue has more of a direct connection to their ancestors only a few centuries earlier. That's why they care about the statue. I mean, if you look around nowadays, nobody's really worshiping en masse, anyway, any kind of a statue that is legitimately 2,000 years old, right? I know that people worship things that are supposedly 2,000 years old, but anybody who's worshiping something right now that is supposedly several millennia old, I guarantee you can point that object to me and I can scientifically prove to you that that object is not thousands of years old. I guarantee you whatever object is being worshipped right now is not that old at all. And the reason why is simple, because humans don't hold on to stuff that long. Right? It's the simple property of disassociation. You aren't crying about your grandfather or your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who lived, back in the 2000 BC period dying because you're just disassociated from the person. You're not a bad person for not crying about the death of your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, but you just have no reason to do it because you have no connection. There's nothing there. Same thing goes for everything else in history. People over time lose connections to things, right? Newer generations want to do different things than the people who came before them, generally speaking, right? And that's kind of one of the things that the power structure right now is taking advantage of and completely used to absolutely twist and destroy civilization right now, but that's a whole other topic as well. But there's no reason to believe that any of these artifacts are 2,000 plus years old. So the ruins that Petrarch is finding and that he's walking around in, and that he's not finding, by the way, because remember, he doesn't find the vast majority of the stuff he expected to find. These ruins are not that old. And Petrarch runs into this problem, and he writes about it in his own letters. Anyway, he also runs across some other famous names that exist down there. One of the names he runs into is Apollo. And Apollo is rumored to have simply been an astrologer, a devil, and the god of the Saracens for some weird reason. He finds the name Plato being mentioned down there, and Plato was considered a doctor. Cicero is considered a knight and a troubadour. Have you ever heard of Cicero being considered a knight and a troubadour? When a mainstream historian is presented with evidence like this is all immediately thrown into the anachronism bucket. You are not allowed to take any of this seriously, but it really begs the question, why is the population talking about a completely different kind of landscape when it comes to their history? Remember, Petrarch is just visiting. He's just a tourist. He does not live in the area. He has no real ties to that area with any kind of a historical, depth. He's not like that. He's just there trying to find and record whatever he can and fit it into his worldview. So what he's discovering is that the people who do know their history, the locals, the people who you should be listening to, I know, Jesus. I swear, if there is one thing that angers me more than anything when it comes to the way mainstream historians treat history, is the insane way that they continue to ignore the local populations and the local population's stories about their own history, and they always take the position of some crazy academic over the locals, and they do this every single time. I mean, literally, all of modern mainstream historians should just be called Petrarchs. Everybody's a Petrarch now, basically, right? But it's even worse today because people... Okay, I don't know. Basically, what Petrarch finds is that his idealized version of ancient Rome literally does not exist. There's nothing there. There's no evidence to support any of the claims from any of the books that he had been reading prior to showing up over there in Italy. and all of the populations completely disagree with any of his preconceived notions as well, as he learns, as he starts to talk to everybody in the area. What this starts to point to then is that the events of supposed ancient Rome did not take place in the early first millennium, AD or BC, depending on what aspect of Rome we're talking about here. But instead, these events had taken place only a few centuries before Petrarch's arrival. Things will actually get even crazier beyond Petrarch, actually, because as the histories will continue to be written about ancient Rome after Petrarch passes on, and everybody keeps going and moving forward with their own personal history, what will happen is that even events that took place after the 14th century AD will be thrown back in time into the ancient Roman period. So by that I literally mean, let's say in 1550 AD, there could have been some kind of political event that went down, and instead of getting that 1550 AD for that event, instead that event was thrown back upwards of at least 1,000 years into the past, and then given credit to ancient Rome for having participated in whatever the hell that event was. Essentially what's going on is that a lot of medieval history, for whatever reason, and we've kind of talked about it and we have a lot more to say about it, is being duplicated and thrown backwards in time. And that is what we see today as real historians. There's no other outcome. You literally cannot look at history objectively and come to any other conclusion. We even find historians like Petrarch dealing with this problem in his own period of time. So it gets weird to see mainstream historians having no problem quoting Petrarch's version of ancient Rome when we know that he even admits that he is unable to find the evidence to support a lot of the claims that he will eventually compile together in his works. This is not good history. It's crazy. Essentially, what we are beginning to figure out is that all of those books that Petrarch had originally read that dealt with some kind of a supposed ancient Rome were probably referring to the Rome on the Bosporus. However, in the early 14th century or even later, it was ordered to assume that the ancient manuscripts referred to Italian Rome. Right? That is how the changes go down. And there's several different power structures which will ultimately order these kinds of changes. And of course, the church is the number one power structure that orders all of these changes. Why would the church do something like this? Well, it's simple. Right? The church, of course, had just come into and was gaining extraordinary amounts of power. So if they could change and rewrite the history to where they were already and always in charge of the entire area for the past couple of thousand years, right, then that gives them a right to rule in the way they want to rule. And that's exactly what happened. So basically, it's funny. If you believe in modern chronology, you actually believe in the Bible, and you actually have to believe in the church's version of history. So for anybody who is an atheist, that's kind of ironic, right? Because that means atheists everywhere who believe in the modern chronology quite literally believe that the church is accurate and correct and not corrupt. Yeah, it's hilarious. This is the kind of world we live in right now. We literally seriously live in a world to where secular scientists have even more faith right now in the Bible than probably your average religious person who is willing to call out the inaccuracies in the Bible and with the church. It's insane. Like, the hypocrisy is just a nightmare. And you better believe that certain power structures on this planet are taking advantage of all of this confusion and hypocrisy. I mean, this is exactly what they love. Okay, anyway, I know. So, okay, I'll wrap this up. Basically, when we look at Petrarch and we actually do any kind of a semi-deep dive into how he came to the conclusions that he came to, we have no choice but to acknowledge the dishonest approach that he would eventually take when he began to piece together his version of ancient Rome. And please believe, it is his version. Now, one of the reasons why his version has been allowed to survive to modern day and age is because we don't have a whole lot of work that really supports any kind of evidence of any sort of an ancient Roman Empire. So if you can find somebody who talks a lot about it, and of course, if you already believe in the empire itself, this is good stuff. And that is exactly what has happened. Modern historians are grasping at straws, and Petrarch had a ton of them waiting for him. Oh, yeah, you know what? I should have said this earlier. Another thing about Petrarch is this. So Petrarch obviously used all kinds of earlier sources to create what he thought was going to be, the ancient Rome that he was going to be looking for. So when he was out there gathering up all of these books, you would think that we would have like some kind of a huge Petrarch library sitting on the side to where we could go and corroborate all of the stuff that Petrarch claims happened. We have 0 of these works that Petrarch ends up citing. I think that deserves to be repeated because mainstream historians don't seem to want to understand this. We have precisely 0 original works that Petrarch cites for his conclusions. This is bad history. There is no way around this. If any kind of a mainstream historian is going to use Petrarch as a foundation for their version of what they suppose is ancient Rome, then we can scientifically make the claim that that historian is wrong. If that historian is wrong, that means their chronology is wrong as well. If their chronology is wrong, that means that anything calibrated on that chronology is also wrong. Basically, we have a situation to where all of mainstream chronology is wrong. Now, there's a ton more stuff with Petrarch that I really should have gone over, but I'll cut it. It's an hour. I get it. We'll talk about it in other shows because we have a lot of stuff to destroy relative to the mainstream chronology. So just, if you got nothing else out of this, just remember, everything I said, it's fact. These is not schizo ramblings that I just had when I was dreaming up some random stuff and decided to go on YouTube and start talking garbage. That's not what this is. This is all scientific fact. What this means is that if you are dating something like, say, the pyramids, utilizing mainstream chronology, I'm sorry, your dates are wrong. There's no way around it. Because the reality is, this frees you from having to adhere to a lie that you probably suspected in the first place. I actually can't stress enough, once you start to acknowledge that modern chronology is just absolutely wrong, it's amazing how freeing it is. Your research will completely change. And I get that can kind of be a pain in the butt because, yeah, everything you thought you knew is going to change. Because I'm literally telling you that there are Roman empires which you have been trained to think existed your entire life, never existed ever once, never at all, ever. There's no such thing as 1 and 2 Roman empires. There has only ever been one Rome. And I've covered some of that, I think, on this channel, and we'll talk more about it later. But the evidence is what the evidence is. Don't forget, the archaeological evidence syncs up with this as well. There's no way around this. So when we look at the archaeological evidence, and when we look at the historical evidence, and we look at it through a scientific lens, we have no choice but to come to the conclusion that somebody like Petrarch is just wrong. And, worst case scenario, he was malicious. I don't know. Or even funnier, he never existed at all. And somebody else created Petrarch and then, did what they did with all that information. And now we are where we are right now. The whole thing is just absolutely crazy. Okay. Yeah, so we're in one hell of a situation, especially if you believe in any of these, phantom empires, essentially. The first two Roman empires literally never existed, and you could argue that the third one, well, not argue, I guess it's true, the main Roman Empire that supposedly existed, it never existed in Italy. It only ever existed over in Byzantium. And of course, this squares away that whole side of that particular area of history, because now we don't have to have the Roman Empire moving from the west to the east for some stupid random reason, right? It doesn't make sense anyway. And this is why it doesn't make sense. It's because this stuff simply never happened. Modern chronology, with respect to ancient Rome, is completely wrong. It is false. None of those events took place in antiquity.